New Orleans has always been a city of mysteries, its streets echoing with tales of ghosts and legends. But there is one story that stands above the rest, a tale whispered in hushed tones even today, a story that begins on a sweltering summer night in 1918. I had just moved to New Orleans, lured by the promise of vibrant culture and the intoxicating allure of jazz. The French Quarter, with its wrought iron balconies and cobblestone streets, was everything I had imagined. But beneath the surface charm, there was an undercurrent of unease, a palpable tension that lingered in the air. I first heard the name the Axeman at a local bar, where old men sat nursing their drinks, their faces shadowed by the dim light. They spoke of a phantom, a figure that slipped through the night, wielding an axe with deadly precision. The Axeman of New Orleans had become more than a mere murderer, he was a specter that haunted the dreams of the city's residents. The murders began in May 1918, a spree that lasted over a year, leaving a trail of blood and broken lives. The victims were seemingly chosen at random, their homes invaded in the dead of night, their lives ended with brutal, methodical strokes. No one knew who the Axeman was or why he killed, but his reign of terror gripped the city in fear. As a journalist, I was drawn to the story like a moth to a flame. I pored over old newspapers, combed through police reports, and interviewed anyone who had lived through those harrowing months. The more I learned, the deeper the mystery became. The Axeman seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving no trace behind except for the carnage he wrought. One night, I decided to walk the streets where the murders had taken place, hoping to glean some sense of the terror that had once held New Orleans captive. The air was thick with humidity, and the streetlights cast eerie shadows on the cracked sidewalks. I could almost hear the distant echo of jazz, a haunting melody that seemed to accompany my every step. As I turned a corner, I found myself standing in front of an old, dilapidated house. Its windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling from the walls. This was the site of one of the Axeman's last known attacks. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the darkened structure, imagining the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness of the night, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the distant beat of a drum. My heart raced as I looked around, but I saw no one. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from inside the house. Summoning all my courage, I approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. The tapping continued, echoing through the empty rooms. I followed the sound, my footsteps hesitant, my breath shallow. As I reached the doorway to what must have once been the living room, the tapping abruptly stopped. Silence enveloped me, thick and oppressive. I stood frozen, straining to hear anything, any sign of life or movement. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint, flickering light, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. There, in the corner, stood a figure, a shadowy silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. My blood turned to ice as the figure began to move, stepping closer, the light revealing the glint of something metallic in its hand. The figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "Welcome," it said. "I've been waiting for you." I staggered backward, my mind reeling. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a face twisted with anger and pain. It was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a wild, unkempt beard and eyes that gleamed with a feverish intensity. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely more than a whisper. "The Keeper of Truths," he replied, raising the object in his hand. It was a rusted axe, the blade chipped and stained. The Axeman's story didn't end in 1919. No, it continued in the shadows, in the fears of this city. And now, it's time for the truth to come to light. My heart pounded as I tried to process his words. The Axeman had vanished without a trace, and now this man claimed to hold the key to the mystery. "What do you know about the Axeman?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, the axe glinting menacingly. "I was there," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I saw the terror he unleashed, the lives he shattered. And I've spent my life piecing together the puzzle. I realized then that this man was no killer, he was a broken soul haunted by the past, consumed by the need to uncover the truth." "Tell me what you know," I urged, feeling a strange mix of fear and empathy. He gestured for me to sit, and we settled onto the dusty floor of the abandoned house. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady murmur that echoed in the empty room. "The Axeman was more than just a murderer," he said. "He was a phantom, a manifestation of the city's darkest fears. He chose his victims carefully, targeting those who had wronged him in some way. But his true identity was never discovered. Some say he was a musician, others believe he was a laborer. But I think he was someone who walked among us, hidden in plain sight. As he spoke, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense that I was on the verge of something monumental, a truth that had been buried for decades. Why did he stop? I asked. Why did the killings end? The old man's eyes darkened. Because he was never caught, he said. He slipped away, vanished into the night. But his spirit remained, haunting the city, feeding on the fear he had created. And now, his ghost walks these streets, seeking retribution. A chill ran down my spine. The idea of the Axeman's ghost haunting New Orleans seemed far-fetched, yet the conviction in the old man's voice was undeniable. Do you have proof? I asked, my curiosity piqued. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. This, he said, handing it to me. It's all in here. The clues, the patterns, the connections. I've spent my life documenting everything. And now, it's up to you to finish what I started. I took the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and newspaper clippings. As I flipped through it, a picture began to emerge, a complex web of secrets and lies, all pointing to a truth that had eluded the city for so long. I'll help you, I said, determination rising within me. We'll uncover the truth about the Axeman, once and for all. The old man's eyes softened, a glimmer of hope shining through the darkness. Thank you, he whispered. But be careful. The Axeman's ghost is still out there, watching, waiting. And he doesn't want his secrets revealed. Days turned into weeks as I delved deeper into the old man's journal. Each entry was a puzzle piece, each note a clue. I mapped out the locations of the murders, looking for patterns, searching for any common threads that could tie the victims together. The deeper I dug, the more obsessed I became. One evening, while poring over the journal in my small apartment, I noticed something I had previously overlooked, a series of dates and times scribbled in the margins, alongside cryptic symbols that seemed to form a code. Intrigued, I decided to follow the pattern, convinced it would lead me to the next clue. The next night, I found myself standing outside St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the oldest and most famous cemetery in New Orleans. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, and the silence was almost oppressive. I hesitated at the entrance, the iron gate creaking as I pushed it open. The old man's words echoed in my mind, the Axeman's ghost is still out there, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. As I wandered through the cemetery, I felt an eerie sense of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, set my nerves on edge. I clutched the journal tightly, my eyes scanning the tombstones for any sign of the symbols I had seen in the margins. Then, I saw it, a symbol carved into one of the older tombs, identical to the ones in the journal. My heart raced as I approached, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I reached out to touch the carving, feeling the rough stone beneath my fingertips. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a whispering wind swept through the cemetery. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing a few feet away, was a shadowy figure, its form barely distinguishable in the moonlight. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling. The figure moved closer, stepping into the faint light. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by the shadows. In his hand, he held an axe, the blade glinting menacingly. My blood turned to ice as I realized who it was. The Axeman. The ghostly figure took another step forward, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a tombstone. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. The Axeman spoke, his voice a low, menacing growl. You should not have come here, he said. You seek the truth, but some truths are better left buried. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The Axeman raised the axe, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. To finish what I started, he said. To silence those who would uncover my secrets. Fear surged through me as I turned and ran, the ghostly figure pursuing me through the maze of tombstones. The cemetery seemed to stretch on forever, the path twisting and turning in the darkness. I could hear the Axeman's footsteps close behind, the sound of his breathing growing louder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I stumbled upon an open grave. Desperation fueled my movements as I jumped into the pit, hoping the darkness would hide me. I lay still, my heart pounding, as the Axeman's footsteps drew nearer. I held my breath, trying to silence the frantic pounding of my heart. The footsteps stopped right above me. I could feel his presence, a chilling cold that seeped into my bones. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity as I lay there, the silence thick with tension. Then, I heard it, a rustling, followed by the faint sound of breathing. The Axeman was searching for me, his patience seemingly infinite. I clutched the journal to my chest, its pages now feeling like my only lifeline. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence, the distant strains of a jazz melody, haunting and beautiful, drifting through the night. The Axeman paused, his head turning towards the music. The eerie light in his eyes flickered, as if the melody had reached some hidden part of his soul. Taking advantage of his distraction, I slowly inched my way out of the grave, careful not to make a sound. The music grew louder, filling the cemetery with its haunting beauty. With one last look at the Axeman, who seemed almost mesmerized by the melody, I bolted towards the cemetery gate. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my apartment, slamming the door behind me and collapsing to the floor, gasping for breath. As I sat there, the journal still clutched in my hands, I realized the music had saved me. It was the key, the final piece of the puzzle. The Axeman was connected to the music of New Orleans in a way I hadn't fully understood before. Determined to uncover the truth, I opened the journal to the pages about the victims. Each victim, I realized, had a connection to music. Some were musicians, others patrons of the city's vibrant jazz scene. The Axeman had not been a random killer, he had been striking at the heart of the city's soul, its music. And now, his ghost continued to haunt the streets, drawn by the melodies that once defined his life. I knew what I had to do. I contacted the old man, arranging to meet him in a jazz club that had stood since the Axeman's reign of terror. As the band played, their music filling the room with a powerful, almost magical energy, I laid out my findings. The old man listened, his eyes widening with each revelation. The music, he murmured. Of course. It was always about the music. He was a musician, and in death, he's still drawn to it, unable to let go. We agreed to conduct one final investigation, a seance of sorts, using the power of the music to draw the Axeman's spirit out. That night, we gathered in the club, the band playing a haunting, melancholic tune that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the city. As the music played, a chill filled the air. The lights flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared in the center of the room. The Axeman's ghost, his eyes no longer filled with malice but with a deep, sorrowful longing. I stepped forward, the journal in my hand. "You don't have to haunt this city anymore," I said, my voice steady. "Your story will be told. Your music will be remembered." The Axeman's ghost seemed to waver, as if caught between two worlds. The band played on, their music reaching a crescendo, and for a moment, the ghost appeared almost human, his face softening with a trace of peace. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the Axeman was gone. The room returned to normal, the chill dissipating. The old man and I stood in silence, the weight of what we had witnessed settling over us. The mystery of the Axeman of New Orleans had been solved, not through fear and violence, but through understanding and music. His spirit had been laid to rest, his story finally told. And as I walked out into the night, the city's jazz once again filled the air, a reminder that even the darkest of tales can find a harmonious end.